Welcome to this trip through one of the most disturbing cases in the history of the Missouri Ozarks. Before we start, please leave a comment telling us where you are and what time it is where you are right now. We want to know where these written accounts go and at what times of day or night they get there. In the fall of 1891, the small town of Hollow Creek in the Missouri Ozarks became the center of a series of events that would stay hidden in county records for decades. Eliza and Ruth Blackwood ran a small boarding house on the edge of town. Tired travelers and workers from the nearby mines would stop there for a hot meal and a place to sleep. People said that the sisters were very welcoming and that their hearty stew tasted like nothing else they had ever had. But what started as rumors among locals would turn into one of the most disturbing investigations in Douglas County history. Farmers and timber workers looking to make money off the Ozark Mountains' rich natural resources founded the settlement of Hollow Creek in 1843. By 1891, the town had about 300 people living there. The main street had a general store, a post office, and a church. There were homesteads and small farms on the hills around the area, and thick forests of oak, hickory, and pine separated them. These properties were very isolated, especially in the winter, when snow and ice made travel almost impossible. The Blackwood family was one of the first families to settle there, coming from Tennessee in 1846. County records show that Samuel Blackwood bought 80 acres about 2 miles from the center of town. There was a natural spring on the property, and it was next to what locals called the Devil's Backbone, a steep and rocky ridge that cut through the landscape. Samuel and his wife Martha kept their kids mostly to themselves. They didn't go to many community events and only talked to their neighbors a little bit. Sheriff Thomas Hargrove noticed an unusual pattern at the Blackwood boarding house that made him think something was wrong. Between March and October of 1891, employers or family members of 7 men who had signed up at the establishment said they were missing. When looking over the ledger, which showed that each man had stayed exactly 1 night before disappearing, the common thread was found almost by accident. What was even stranger was that none of their things were ever found. There was no sign that they had ever been there, not even a suitcase, pocket watch, or hat. The first person to go missing was William Jennings, a cattle buyer from Street Lewis who was traveling through the area to buy livestock for eastern markets. Records from the Douglas County Courthouse show that Jennings came to Hollow Creek on the 17th of March, 1891. That night, he was last seen going into the Blackwood boarding house after doing business with a few local farmers. 2 days later, they found his horse and saddle wandering near Bryant Creek, which is about 5 miles from town. Sheriff Hargrove put together a search party, but they couldn't find any sign of Jennings. The second person went missing in April. James Thurston, a mineral surveyor for the Missouri Pacific Railroad, didn't tell his boss that he had spent the night at the Blackwood establishment. At first, his company thought he had quit, which sometimes happens with men who are sent to work in remote areas. People started to wonder where he was when his personal things were found almost completely intact in his Springfield office. A coworker said that Thurston had talked about looking into possible mining sites near Hollow Creek. The boarding house ledger had his signature on it from April 23rd, with a neat check mark next to it. This showed that he was leaving the next morning. By July, 5 more men had gone missing in the same way: a timber buyer, 2 traveling salesmen, a photographer who was taking pictures of Ozark landscapes, and a doctor who had just opened a practice in the nearby town of Ava. The Blackwood ledger showed when each of them arrived and left, but none of them were ever seen again after they entered the boarding house. Sheriff Hargrove asked the sisters the same questions over and over again, but he couldn't find any proof that they had done anything wrong. Their answers were the same. They were calm, and their reputation in the community, while a little reserved, had never suggested anything bad. Not only are the disappearances scary, but the fact that no one talked about them is even scarier. Neighbors said they didn't hear anything strange coming from the property. The sisters kept serving meals, taking care of their garden, and going to church on Sundays without any problems. It was like the air around the boarding house didn't want to carry sound. Eliza would just show the ledger with the clearly marked departure dates of the missing guests, which were always the day after they arrived. In August 1891, Martha Collins, whose farm was next to the Blackwood property, gave Sheriff Hargrove a statement that he wrote down in his personal journal. She said that even though their homes were close to each other, she never heard voices, chopping wood, or other normal sounds coming from the boarding house. She said, "It ain't natural. Even on calm summer nights when sound travels far, that place is as quiet as a grave. The only thing you ever hear is the dinner bell, which rings every night at 6. People in the area said that Ruth Blackwood, the younger sister at 37, was shy and didn't talk much in public. Eliza, her 2-year-old sister, ran the business and spoke for their business. People who went there often said that Ruth would spend hours taking care of a small garden behind the kitchen where she grew herbs and vegetables. The sisters never seemed to buy meat from the local butcher, Jacob Winters, even though the garden was small. This was strange to them. But their stew, which they served to guests every day, was famous for being thick and tasty. In a statement he made in late October 1891, Winters himself pointed out this oddity. He told Sheriff Hargrove, "I've been running the butcher shop here for 15 years. Everyone in Hollow Creek buys their meat from me, except the Blackwood sisters. I asked Eliza about it once, and she just smiled and said they have their own deals with suppliers further south. That didn't make sense to me. There aren't any other butchers for 30 miles in any direction." The boarding house was 2 stories tall. The upper floor had 6 guest rooms, and the ground floor had the sisters' rooms, kitchen, and dining room. The wooden frame was held up by a stone foundation. The sides were made of oak planks that had turned a dull gray over time. A split rail fence surrounded the whole property. The gate was never locked, but it made a loud noise when it opened, which let the sisters know when someone was coming. There was a small smokehouse and root cellar behind the main building. These were common features of rural properties at the time, when it was important to keep food fresh. If it weren't for Marshall Cooper, a railroad worker who stayed at the boarding house in November 1891, the investigation might have stayed quiet. Cooper left before breakfast, which was different from what other guests had done. He said he had to leave early. 3 days later, he went back to Hollow Creek and saw some things that worried him. While he was there, he couldn't sleep and saw Ruth carry something heavy to the basement in the middle of the night. What bothered him the most wasn't the activity itself, but how the sisters acted at dinner. Cooper's statement, which is still on file with the county, says that they watched him eat in a way that made him feel uncomfortable. They didn't blink, he said, not once during the whole meal. Cooper's statement, from the 12th of November, 1891, gives more information that seems important now that we look back on it. He said that the stew they had that night was very rich, and that the meat fell apart when you touched it with a fork. He also said that when he praised the food, Eliza reacted with what he called an inappropriate level of pride, saying that they were very selective about the ingredients. What worried him the most was how the sister reacted when he told her he was one of 7 kids from a big family in Illinois. He said their faces changed. They looked almost disappointed. After that, they were much less welcoming. Sheriff Hargrove looked more closely at past disappearances after reading Cooper's report. He found out that all of the missing people had been traveling alone. Most were single men who didn't know many people in the area, and all had been called robust or well-built. The pattern suggested that they were chosen carefully, not just by chance. The sheriff could only increase patrols near the boarding house and tell travelers to be careful, though, because there was no proof. Sheriff Hargrove's journal entry from the 28th of November, 1891, shows that he was becoming more and more suspicious. Rode past the Blackwood place again today. Eliza was hanging laundry and greeted me as always. She asked me about business in a casual way, asking if they had had many guests lately. She said things were slow with winter coming on. But I saw smoke coming from their chimney at all hours of the day and night. Someone is keeping a fire well fed in that kitchen. On the 12th of December 1891, things changed. A bad winter storm had settled over the Ozarks, so the sisters had to stay inside for a few days. Joseph Winters, the butcher's cousin and a local farmer, knocked on their door to get out of the sudden blizzard. He tried the handle when no one answered and found that it was open. What he found inside would stay with Hollow Creek for a long time. Sheriff Hargrove got Joseph Winters' story on the 13th of December, 1891. The written statement, which is kept in the county archives, goes into great detail about what happened to him. I yelled when I got there, thinking maybe they hadn't heard me knock because of the wind. The main room of the boarding house looked normal, even welcoming, with a fire still burning in the hearth. I yelled again, and then went to the kitchen, thinking they might be making food. It was the kitchen that first made me worry. He talked about a lot of knives that were bigger than what you would normally use for cooking and were carefully arranged on the wall. There was a pot of stew on the stove that smelled good at first, but when he got close, he saw something strange floating in the mixture that looked like a human finger. Winters left right away to tell Sheriff Hargrove, who put together a group of men to look into it. When they got back, they saw the sisters sitting quietly at the kitchen table, as if they had been waiting for them. When they were arrested, neither woman fought back. The search that came after showed the full extent of what had been going on at the Blackwood boarding house. Sheriff Hargrove and 2 deputies wrote down what happened during the first search of the property on December 12 and 13, 1891. On the surface, their reports make it sound like a normal boarding house. The guest rooms were clean and well kept, with new sheets on each bed. There were no signs of fighting or trouble in the common areas. The horrible truth didn't start to come out until they got to the kitchen and the cellar. The trapdoor in the kitchen floor led to the cellar, which had evidence that would shock even the most experienced police officers. Sheriff Hargrove's official report from the 14th of December, 1891, says that they found a room that had been turned into what he called a processing room. Hooks were hanging from the beams in the ceiling. There were channels in the stone floor that let water flow away. On one wall, a workbench held a variety of tools, including saws and cleavers. The most disturbing thing was that a big trunk held personal items like watches, wallets, boots, and other things that matched what the missing men were carrying. It looks like Eliza kept a journal that had dates, names, and weights, followed by notes on quality and flavor. The last pages had recipes written in a neat, methodical hand. One entry from the journal dated the 24th of April, 1891, the same day James Thurston went missing, said, "Subject lean but muscular, approximately 175 pounds. Slight bitterness noted, possibly due to tobacco use. Will adjust seasoning accordingly for next preparation." The clinical tone of these notes made it clear that the writers were not very concerned about the people they were killing. The search went to the smokehouse behind the main building, where investigators found what looked like preserved human remains. Sheriff Hargrove's report says that they found different cuts of meat that were carefully wrapped in butcher paper and had dates on them. Dr. Samuel Wilson, the doctor from Ava who took over for the missing doctor, confirmed that these samples came from people. Historians still can't agree on what happened in the months that followed. There are gaps in the official records from that time, and some pages are missing from the county courthouse archives. People know that the sisters were in jail in Douglas County waiting for their trial. Reports in newspapers from nearby counties covered the case with a mix of horror and morbid interest. In January 1892, the Springfield Republican ran a series of articles that called the women the Butchers of Hollow Creek. The Springfield Republican's the 7th of January 1892 issue had one of the most thorough reports on the case that the public could read at the time. The front page story, "Horror in the Hills," Ozark sisters accused of feeding human flesh to unwary travelers, talked about how shocked the community was and what the case meant for the bigger picture. That such barbarism could exist within our civilized state, merely a day's journey from our own city, must give pause to all who believe in the inherent progress of mankind. The good people of Douglas County are left to wonder how many innocent travelers met their end in that quiet house, and more disturbingly, how many unknowing visitors to the region might have partaken of the sisters' infamous stew during community gatherings. A document found in 1965 while the old courthouse was being renovated suggests that Ruth Blackwood gave a statement to the police. Ruth said that their father, a trapper and hunter, taught them that all meat is the same and that hunger knows no morality. She said that growing up in the isolated hills was a constant fight against hunger, especially during the harsh winters that followed the Civil War. Ruth's statement gives us a look into the sisters' childhood that might help us understand why they did what they did later on, but it doesn't make it right. She said that their father went missing for 3 days in the winter of 1866, when food was running low and game was hard to find. When he got back, he brought meat that kept the family going until spring. Years after his death, The sisters found human remains buried near their property line. Instead of being horrified by this discovery, it seems to have made the idea of cannibalism as a way to stay alive more normal. More research into the Blackwood family's past showed that Samuel Blackwood fought for the Confederacy during the Civil War. Military records show that he was in a unit that was cut off from supplies for several weeks during the winter of 1864. Veterans heard rumors that some soldiers had to eat the bodies of their dead friends to stay alive. These stories, though not confirmed, point to a possible reason for Samuel's later actions. Eliza, on the other hand, never gave a reason for what they did. People who visited the jail said that she would sit still for hours, staring at the wall without blinking. Dr. Samuel Wilson, the local doctor, wrote in his notes that he thought her behavior was unnatural and disturbing, which could mean that she had some kind of mental illness. It is not clear if this was a condition she already had or if it happened after her arrest. Dr. Wilson's medical journal, some of which is kept in the University of Missouri archives, has a lot of information about Eliza Blackwood's mental state. On the 15th of January 1892, he wrote, "The patient continues to have catatonic episodes that alternate with periods of apparent lucidity. During these latter phases, she talks normally about everyday things, but refuses to admit the charges against her. When asked about the evidence found at the boarding house, she just says, 'Waste not, want not,' and goes back to being quiet. I believe she is suffering from a deep moral insanity that may have been made worse by her upbringing in isolation." The case never went to court. A fire broke out in the Douglas County Jail on the 23rd of February, 1892. When the fire was put out, 3 cells were completely destroyed, including the one where the Blackwood sisters lived. At first, it was thought that both women died in the fire, but their bodies were never found because the fire was so bad. Fire Chief Walter Brennan's official report on the jail fire says that the fire started shortly after midnight in the cell block where the sisters were living. The whole eastern part of the building was on fire by the time the volunteer fire department got there. Even though people tried to put out the fire, it spread quickly because the jail's interior was made of wood. It was said that 3 prisoners, including the Blackwood sisters, had died. Chief Brennan did, however, point out one strange thing. The cell door was found open, even though protocols say that all cells must be locked after 10 p.m. But an entry in Sheriff Hargrove's personal journal, which was found after he died in 1907, makes this conclusion less certain. He wrote, "I can't shake the feeling that they are still out there. Last night, I dreamed of them standing at the edge of my property, watching my house. When I woke up, I saw footprints in the snow outside my window, 2 sets, side by side." Hargrove's journal entries show that he became more and more paranoid in the years after the fire. He wrote about feeling like he was being watched while he worked and getting packages with cuts of meat wrapped in butcher paper that looked familiar. It's not clear if these events really happened or were just the result of a guilty conscience. Some historians think that Hargrove may have helped the sister escape by bribing or threatening her, and that he lived in fear of being caught or punished for the rest of his life. In the spring of 1892, the Blackwood boarding house was taken down. People in the area wouldn't let anyone take anything from the building, saying that everything had to be burned. For decades, the land stayed empty, and people in the area stayed away from it. Workers reported finding something strange when a survey was done in 1923 for a possible road expansion. They found a second cellar room under where the kitchen used to be that had not been found during the first search. There were preserved clothes from the 1,870 seconds in this room, which suggests that the sisters' activities may have started long before 1891. On the 12th of June 1923, Missouri Department of Transportation engineer Harold Jenkins filed a survey report that said the hidden cellar was about 8 feet square, with walls made of fitted stone and a floor made of packed earth. The entrance was hidden under what looked like a solid part of the main cellar floor and could only be reached by taking off a carefully hidden trapdoor. Inside, Jenkins and his team found shelves full of glass jars that looked like they had food in them that had been preserved, but the food had long since gone bad. The personal items, like shoes, watches, eyeglasses, and other things, were even more disturbing because they suggested that there were more victims than those found in the official investigation. Jenkins also said that he found a small leather-bound book stuck between the stones of the wall. The book had handwritten entries from 1873 to 1890, which is probably the same book that was found during the first investigation. Even though a lot of the text was hard to read because of water damage, pieces of it suggested that there was a methodical record of victims that lasted almost 20 years. It is said that the Douglas County Sheriff's Office got the book, but there is no record of it in official records. In 1942, historian Margaret Holloway began looking into the Blackwood sisters for a book about crime in the Ozarks. This may have been the most disturbing part of the case. She was looking at census records from 1870 to 1890 when she found something shocking. The official records said that the Blackwood family had 4 sisters, not 2. Holloway only found vague references to the other siblings moving west around 1885 when she tried to find out more about them. There were no more records of either woman. Holloway's research notes, which are only partially preserved in the Missouri Historical Society, say that the missing sisters are Catherine and Mary Blackwood, who were born in 1850 and 1853, respectively. In the 1880 census, both of them were listed as living at the family home. Eliza and Ruth were the only ones left by the 1890 census. Holloway said that Samuel Blackwood died in 1883, which was around the time that the Boardinghouse business started. Local records say that Martha Blackwood died of a wasting illness in 1878 before this. Holloway came up with a disturbing theory after making this discovery, that Eliza and Ruth may have started their behavior with people in their own families. This theory became more believable when she found a report from a traveling salesman who had been to the Blackwood home in 1884. He wrote in his journal that he met 4 sisters and that they seemed tense around each other. When he came back in 1886, only Eliza and Ruth were still there. The salesman, Theodore Grant, wrote in his journal on the 3rd of September 1884, "I went to the Blackwood house today to sell household goods. I was met by the eldest sister, Miss Eliza, who asked me to tea. There were 4 sisters there, but 2 of them seemed reluctant to talk. Miss Catherine looked very upset, hardly touching her food and flinching every time Miss Eliza spoke to her. When I asked how they were doing, Miss Ruth said that getting ready for winter had been hard, which was strange since it was still early autumn." Grant's next entry, from the 17th of August 1886, says, "I went back to the Blackwood home. Only Miss Eliza and Miss Ruth were there. When I asked about their sisters, Miss Eliza told me they had moved on to better opportunities out west. She then offered me a bowl of stew, which I turned down because I had already made plans. Something in her face made me glad I left so quickly." Holloway's research came to an abrupt end in March of 1943. Her co-workers at the University of Missouri said that she had gone to Hollow Creek to look at the site where the boarding house used to be. She didn't come back from this trip. People found her notes and research materials in her abandoned car near where she was last seen, but Holloway herself vanished without a trace. The sheriff in the area looked into it, but didn't find any signs of foul play. In the end, her case was filed as an unexplained disappearance. Dr. Robert Thornton, the head of the University of Missouri Department, wrote a memo on the 12th of April 1943 expressing concern about Holloway's disappearance. "Miss Holloway was one of our most careful researchers. She didn't let her imagination run wild or act carelessly. She planned to go to the Blackwood site for academic reasons, as part of her methodical approach to documenting history. It is completely out of character for her to leave her car and research materials behind." I fear something bad has happened, but it's hard to imagine what that might be after so many years have passed since the original events. The search for Holloway lasted almost 2 weeks and included both local police and university volunteers. Tracking dogs followed her scent from her abandoned car to the old boarding house site, where it suddenly stopped. A full search of the area found nothing out of the ordinary, but a few searchers said they heard what they called a unnatural silence while they were on the property, as if the air itself was dampening sound. In 1952, workers building a new highway found a bunch of human bones in a cave that was about 3 miles from the old Blackwood property. An examination by forensic scientists showed that the remains belonged to at least 9 people, Carbon dating said the person died between 1880 and 1895. More importantly, a lot of the bones had cut marks that looked like they were made by butchering. The case was briefly reopened, but it was quickly closed again because all the main people involved were dead and there were no new conclusions. People in the area called the cave Devil's Backbone Ridge. It looked like it had been sealed off with rocks and brush, making it hard to see from the outside. Frank Miller, the engineering supervisor, wrote in his report, "While clearing the proposed highway route, blasting exposed what appeared to be a natural cave formation. Upon closer inspection, we found the entrance had been deliberately obscured. Inside, scattered approximately 20 feet from the entrance, we discovered human remains. The bones were not arranged in any recognizable burial pattern, but rather appeared to have been discarded haphazardly, as if of no further use." Dr. Howard Mitchell of the Missouri State Medical Examiner's Office did a forensic analysis that showed that the remains were from more than one person of different ages. His report said, "Cut marks on the larger bones, especially the femurs and humeri, show that they were deliberately cut up with sharp tools. These marks are more like butchering than ritualistic mutilation or medical dissection. Also, many bones show signs of having been exposed to heat, which suggests that they were cooked before being thrown away. The evidence was mostly broken up, and the time that had passed made it hard to figure out who the remains belonged to. A silver pocket watch found with the bones, on the other hand, was linked to James Thurston, a mineral surveyor who went missing in April 1891. This link was the strongest link between the cave discovery and the Blackwood case. The most recent thing to happen in the Blackwood case was when Edwin Marsh, a retired postal worker, got in touch with the Douglas County Historical Society in 1968. Marsh, who was in his 92nds at the time, said that when he was young he delivered mail to a cabin in the Montana Territory in 1895. He said that the two old women who lived there looked a lot like pictures of the Blackwood sisters in the newspaper. The discovery of an old leather-bound book among his wife's belongings after she died is what made him write the letter after all those years. The book had handwritten recipes, one of which was called Special Stew. The Historical Society kept Marsh's letter and the recipe book, but they say they lost them when they moved to new buildings in 1969. Marsh wrote a letter on the 15th of January 1968, in which he talked more about his meetings with the women in Montana. They lived in a cabin near the Bitterroot Mountains, far from any neighbors. I delivered mail there monthly for about 2 years. They went by the name Smith, but I recall noticing their acceptance of that name seemed practiced, almost rehearsed. They raised chickens and kept a vegetable garden, but also took in occasional boarders, always men traveling alone. I remember feeling uneasy in their presence, though they were unfailingly polite. The older one would watch me with an intensity that made the hairs on my neck stand up. I left that route in 1897 and never learned what became of them. Marsh found a recipe book with dozens of recipes, most of which were for typical dishes of the time. The Special Stew recipe, on the other hand, had strange instructions and ingredients. Marsh said that the recipe called for marinating meat in a mix of certain herbs and spices, with the note that proper selection ensures tenderness. It also gave exact cooking times and serving suggestions, including the suggestion that it be presented with enthusiasm and observed closely for full appreciation. It is not clear how Marsh's wife got this book. He only said that she had bought a trunk full of old books at an estate sale in Helena, Montana in the 1922. If Marsh hadn't seen the similarities to newspaper stories he had read decades earlier, the link to the Blackwood case might never have been made. The story of the Blackwood sisters is a disturbing part of Ozark history that many people still don't want to talk about. There are still no buildings on the site of the Boardinghouse, just a small group of trees and the remains of a stone foundation. People who visit the area sometimes say that there is an unusual silence that comes over them when they pass by, as if the sound itself is swallowed by the memory of what happened there. Clarence Wilson, a local resident, told a regional newspaper in 1965 about the community's ongoing relationship with the Blackwood legacy. Growing up in Hollow Creek, we weren't told the details, just warned to stay away from that place. My grandfather would tan our hides if he caught us anywhere near it. said the ground there was poisoned. As adults, we learned the truth, or parts of it anyway. Some things are best left buried, I reckon. But even now, folks around here won't eat at a stranger's table without knowing where the meat came from. And no one, and I mean no one, serves stew at community gatherings. We still don't know what made the two women do what they did. Some historians cite the harsh realities of rural life after the Civil War, where hunger and lack of basic needs were common. Others propose that more intricate psychological factors may arise from their isolated upbringing or potential traumatic experiences during their developmental years. We may never know the whole truth. Dr. Eleanor Apprentice, a psychologist who looked into the case in the 1950 seconds, said that the sisters had a shared psychosis that got worse because they were alone and probably had traumatic childhood experiences. She wrote in a 1957 article for the Journal of Criminal Psychology that the Blackwood case is a fascinating example of folie à deux, or shared madness. It seems likely that Eliza, as the dominant personality, developed a pathological response to early experiences of starvation and possibly abuse. Ruth, the more passive sister, adopted these beliefs and behaviors as a way to survive. Their actions, while horrible, made sense to them based on their distorted view of the world. Most mainstream histories have forgotten about the Blackwood case. It is only mentioned in specialized studies of rural crime in the 1800s. This lack of clarity may be appropriate. Like the quiet way the sisters went about their business, their story has faded into whispers, mostly preserved in bits and pieces of records and local oral tradition. In 1960, an old man who lived in Hollow Creek and was one of the few who would talk about the case gave what may have been the most frightening view. She told a reporter who came to see her, the worst part wasn't what they did, it was how normal they seemed. Eliza would bring her stew to church potlucks. Everyone complimented her on it. Everyone ate it. And all the while, she would just smile and thank them for their kind words. Sometimes I wonder if we all knew somehow, if we all chose not to see what was right in front of us. This observation brings up what may be the most troubling part of the case: the sisters' ability to live in the community while hiding who they really are. The Blackwood sisters were able to keep doing what they were doing for years because they acted like normal people. This is different from many other famous criminals who worked in secret or on the fringes of society. They went to church, took part in local events, and had what seemed like normal relationships with their neighbors, all while doing terrible things behind closed doors. This duality makes us think about what evil is and how it can hide in plain sight. The sisters didn't look like monsters. They looked like regular people. This fact, more than the horrible details of their crimes, still bothers people who are looking into the case. It implies that the distinctions between normalcy and depravity may be more fluid than we are willing to acknowledge. The Blackwood Boardinghouse is no longer there, but its shadow is still there. People in Douglas County still tell their kids not to go too far from home in the quiet parts where the hills fold into themselves and it gets dark early. They talk in low voices about the dangers that might be waiting for them, not from supernatural threats, but from the darker sides of human nature. Even though the sisters are no longer with us, their case taught us that the scariest monsters aren't always the ones that hide under beds or in closets. Sometimes they're the ones who sit across from us at the dinner table, passing the salt with a steady hand and an unflinching gaze. The question that may be most disturbing is not what happened to the victims, but what happened to the sisters themselves. If the fire that supposedly killed them was really a complicated trick, where did they go? And even more troubling, did they keep doing what they were doing in a different, more remote place where people who knew their history couldn't see them? Dr. James Randall, a historian who looked into the case in the 1970 seconds, found several reports of travelers going missing in Montana and Idaho between 1895 and 1905 that were similar to the Hollow Creek disappearances. In every case, men who were traveling alone disappeared while they were in remote areas. Even though there was no direct evidence connecting these cases to the Blackwood sisters, the pattern was suggestive. Randall said in his unpublished manuscript, "The trail goes cold after 1905, either because the people who did it stopped, moved to an even more remote place, or maybe finally died of natural causes. Some families in the Ozarks still won't eat stew. Some people still follow the tradition of always having guests stay in pairs or groups, never letting a single traveler stay alone. These small changes in culture show how the Blackwood case has had a lasting effect, even on people who don't know all the details. Sheriff Hargrove may have the last word on the case. In his last journal entry before he died, he wrote, "Some evils are too ordinary to be believed. We expect monsters to look monstrous." The greatest trick the Blackwood sisters ever played was looking just like everybody else. These days, not many people drive on the road that goes by the old Boardinghouse site at night. Drivers in the area would rather take longer routes that don't go through the area at all. Some people say they can smell cooking food carried on the wind on quiet nights, especially in the fall when the leaves have fallen and the trees are bare against the sky. This rich, meaty smell makes those who know the history of the place shudder. The case of the Blackwood sisters is a reminder that history's darkest times don't always happen in the big theaters of war or politics. Sometimes they happen in the quiet corners of everyday communities, where no one thinks to look too closely, question too carefully, or wonder why travelers sometimes come and go. The Missouri State Historical Society put the microfilmed records of the Blackwood case in storage in 1957, but a fire in 1963 destroyed many of the documents from that time. What is left are pieces, echoes, and questions that may never be fully answered, and maybe that uncertainty is the most troubling thing that will last. In 1967, an amateur archaeologist named Robert Thornton was exploring caves in the Ozark region. This led to an interesting footnote in the Blackwood case. He found what looked like a rough stone altar in a small cave about 15 miles from Hollow Creek. There were dozens of small human teeth arranged in circles around the altar. Carbon dating showed that the teeth were from the late 1800s. Local authorities said that none of the identified victims had been reported to have dental problems or missing teeth, even though they couldn't find a direct link to the Blackwood case. When asked about his discovery, Thornton said he found a metal cooking pot near the altar. There were pieces of what looked like a leather-bound book inside, but time and the weather had mostly destroyed it. There was only one page left that was still readable. It had what Thornton called a recipe of sorts, written in a neat feminine hand. The page and pot were given to the police, but they went missing from evidence storage in the early 1972. As we finish looking into one of America's least well-known but most disturbing criminal cases, we can't help but wonder how many other Blackwood sisters might be hiding in the shadows of history. How many more monsters are out there pretending to be normal people and are still able to do bad things without anyone noticing? And how often do we, like the people of Hollow Creek, choose not to see what is right in front of us? Douglas County set up a historical commission in 1959 to protect records and artifacts from the area. One of their first tasks was to try to make sense of the messy archives that were kept in the basement of the courthouse. As part of this work, Emily Peterson, a volunteer archivist, found a small wooden box with things related to the Blackwood case that had never been officially listed. There was a silver locket with the initials CB on it, which may have belonged to Catherine Blackwood, 3 human molars with gold fillings, and a hand-drawn map of the Hollow Creek area with small red crosses marking a few places. Peterson's detailed list shows that the box also had a sealed envelope inside that was addressed to Sheriff Hargrove and dated the 22nd of February, 1892, the day before the jail fire. The envelope had not been opened. When Peterson carefully opened it, she found a single sheet of paper with what looked like a warning written in beautiful script. "We have tasted what others fear to name." The hunger never leaves. By the time you read this, we will be smoke in memory. Look to the daughters of daughters in years to come. At first, people thought the mysterious message was just Eliza Blackwood trying to scare Hargrove before her trial. But in 1961, when local teacher Sarah Collins found out new things about Ruth Blackwood's early life that no one else had known about, the phrase "daughters of daughters" took on a new meaning. Collins looked at county birth records and found that Ruth had a daughter in 1877 when she was 23 years old. There was no name for the father, and the child, who was only known as female infant Blackwood, was not mentioned in any records after that. People thought the child had died as a baby, which was common in rural areas at that time. Collins did find a baptismal record from a Springfield church from 1878 for a girl named Anna Smith. Ruth Blackwood was listed as the mother. The name Smith, which the sisters are said to have used in Montana, made it seem like they were trying to give the child a new name. We still don't know what happened to this daughter. There are no more records of Anna Smith in Missouri archives, and trying to find her through census data has not worked. If she lived to be an adult, she would have been about 15 years old when her mother and aunt supposedly died in a jail fire. Edwin Marsh said he saw women who looked like the Blackwood sisters in Montana when he was in his 32nd. The idea that the Blackwood line might still be alive raises troubling questions. Did Ruth's daughter get her mother's bad habits? Did her parents teach her that cannibalism was okay? And could she have started a new life somewhere else, maybe passing these family traditions on to her children and grandchildren? Richard Blackwell, a novelist, went to Hollow Creek in 1964 to do research for a book that was loosely based on the Blackwood case. He wrote about a number of strange things that happened to him while he was there in his personal journal, which he later gave to the Douglas County Historical Society. Blackwell wrote that he was woken up on his third night in the area, while camping near the old Boardinghouse site, by what sounded like a dinner bell ringing far away. After hearing the noise, he walked into a clearing and saw what looked like a woman in 19th century clothing taking care of a big pot over an open fire. He called out, and the figure disappeared. When he got to the spot, he didn't find any signs of a fire or cooking tools. Blackwell's meeting with an older woman at the local general store was more important. She only gave her name as Mrs. Smith, but she said she had family ties to the area and was very interested in his research. Blackwell's journal says that she invited him to dinner at her rented cabin so they could talk about their families and the history of Hollow Creek. He didn't like the way she acted, so he turned down the invitation. The next day, when he asked about Mrs. Smith at the store, the owner told him that no one by that name had been there recently and that no one by that name was renting property nearby. Blackwell gave up on his project soon after, leaving Hollow Creek without finishing his research. The last entry in his journal says, "Some stories are better left untold. I can't shake the feeling that in looking for the Blackwoods, I have somehow drawn their attention or the attention of something connected to them. The woman's eyes. There was hunger there, but not the usual kind." In 1966, 3 hikers went missing while exploring the Devil's Backbone Ridge near the site of the old boarding house. This brought up the question of possible Blackwood descendants again. A long search found only their camping gear and a journal that belonged to one of the missing men. The last entry said they had met a nice middle-aged woman who had asked them to dinner at her cabin nearby. The local government didn't find any proof that anyone lived in the area. Dr. Lawrence Pritchard, a criminologist who studied serial killers throughout American history, came up with a theory about the Blackwood case that he shared at a conference on historical crimes in 1967. He said that the sisters were a rare case of female serial killers who killed for practical reasons instead of psychological ones. Pritchard said, "The evidence suggests that the Blackwood sisters saw their victims more as resources than as things they wanted or were angry about. This utilitarian perspective on homicide exemplifies a distinct category of criminal psychology, wherein moral constraints against killing are eclipsed by a perverted sense of pragmatism." Pritchard also pointed out that their criminal activities lasted a long time, which was unusual. If the murders started as early as the 1872, as some evidence suggests, and went on until their capture in 1891, the sisters would have been killing people for almost 20 years, which is much longer than most serial killers, who usually kill more people until they are caught or die in a much shorter time frame. This long time frame suggests a level of planning and self-control that is not often seen in these kinds of cases. The Boardinghouse ledger, which is only partly preserved in county records, gives us more information about how the sister worked. It was very important to keep track of guests' names, where they came from, and when they arrived. It looks like a subtle coding system was used to mark preferred victims. A small dot next to certain names, always those of men traveling alone who fit the physical profile of the missing person. This methodical approach bolsters the hypothesis that the sisters intentionally chose their victims rather than acting on impulse. The Missouri Department of Natural Resources did a geological survey of the area around Hollow Creek in 1968. They found a number of strange things in the soil near the old Blackwood property using ground-penetrating radar. Excavation showed 3 separate spots where the ground had been dug up and then filled back in. In one of these places, about half a mile from where the boarding house used to be, technicians found a bunch of human bones and teeth buried about 4 feet below the surface. Forensic analysis showed that these remains belonged to at least 4 adult males. The way the bone was broken up and spread out made it look like it had been prepared for eating, with only the parts that weren't wanted or were too quiet thrown away. Carbon dating showed that the person died between 1,875 and 1,885, which is more proof that the sisters' activities happened before the known disappearances of 1,891. The soil around these remains was noted to be unusually acidic, which sped up the process of decomposition. Dr. Harold Jenkins, who did the analysis, thought that this might not have been a coincidence. The systematic distribution of the remains and the soil chemistry suggest an understanding of how to dispose of bodies in a way that would hasten their breakdown and minimize the chance of discovery. This indicates a level of forethought and knowledge that goes beyond opportunistic killing. This methodical approach to disposal aligns with other evidence of the sisters' careful planning. The hidden cellar room, the remote cave cache, and the coding system in their ledger all point to a calculated operation designed to continue indefinitely without detection. If it hadn't been for Joseph Winters' chance discovery during the blizzard, they might have gotten away with what they were doing for years. Researchers have been interested in the psychological aspects of the Blackwood case for decades. In 1969, Dr. Margaret Simmons wrote in the Journal of Historical Psychology that the sisters had a special kind of shared psychopathology that was caused by their isolated upbringing and traumatic experiences. She wrote, "The combination of extreme isolation, possible childhood abuse, and the violence that was normal in the years after the Civil War made it possible for moral boundaries to be fundamentally changed. Add to this the real experiences of hunger and despair, and you have the basis for a completely new value system in which survival is more important than human life." Simmons also pointed out that there didn't seem to be any sadism in the Blackwood case. The evidence suggests that the sisters saw murder as a practical matter, unlike many famous killers who get pleasure from their victims' suffering. It looks like the victims were killed quickly and efficiently, with no signs of torture or being held for a long time. This utilitarian perspective constitutes an atypical category in the examination of serial killers, wherein emotional or sexual gratification generally assumes a pivotal role. The sisters' ability to separate their personal life from their work is also a very interesting psychological study. They went to church, had what seemed like normal relationships with their neighbors, and took part in local events without anyone being suspicious. This ability to live 2 lives at the same time shows either amazing self-control or a deep disconnection from normal morality. Over the years, local stories about the Blackwood case have changed, adding parts that make it hard to tell what is real and what is not. In the 1970 seconds, people in the Ozarks told stories about a stew woman who would show up to help lost hikers by giving them a place to stay and a hot meal before disappearing with the unlucky traveler. These stories, even though they aren't true, show how the Blackwood case has become part of regional folklore. The reports of strange things happening near the old Boardinghouse site are more important. James Thornton, a local resident, talked about hunting in the area as a young man in the 1950 seconds in an interview from 1972. "I was tracking a deer just before sunset when I caught a whiff of cooking meat, strong enough to make my stomach growl. Following the smell, I came to a clearing I'd never seen before, though I'd hunted those woods all my life. There was nothing there, no fire, no people, but the air was thick with the smell of stew. Something felt wrong, like I was being watched. I left my deer and walked straight out of those woods. Never hunted that ridge again." Similar accounts have been reported over the years. often featuring the smell of cooking food where no source can be identified, or the sound of a dinner bell ringing in the distance. Some people might think these reports are just made up because they know about the Blackwood case, but it's interesting that so many people who don't know the details are saying the same thing. Douglas County finally put up a small historical marker near the site of the old boarding house in 1973. The plaque doesn't say anything about cannibalism or specific crimes. It just says, "Near this location stood the Blackwood boarding house, 1,877 1,892, site of several unsolved disappearances that remain among the most notorious criminal cases in Ozark history." Some people thought the marker should be left alone and not turned into a creepy tourist attraction. The argument over how to remember or whether to remember the Blackwood case is part of a larger discussion about preserving history. Should communities accept the darkest parts of their past, or is it better to let some things fade from memory? The compromise in Douglas County recognition without sensationalism illustrates one strategy for addressing this intricate issue. Dr. Rebecca Morrison, an anthropologist who looked at how the Blackwood case affected culture in the 1,970 seconds, said that some of those effects are still felt today. She said, even among people who say they don't know the details, there are patterns of behavior that seem to be direct responses to the Blackwood legacy. Morrison noted that the reluctance to serve stew at community gatherings, the tradition of traveling in pairs instead of alone, and the persistent weariness toward strangers who show too much interest in local history can all be traced back to the collective trauma of the Blackwood case. She also wrote about what she called protective folklore, stories and warnings passed down through generations that keep people away from the former Blackwood property. These stories don't usually talk about cannibalism directly. Instead, they focus on vague threats and strange disappearances. The effect is to keep a buffer zone around the site without talking about the terrible things that happened there directly. People wondered what would happen to Ruth Blackwood's daughter, Anna Smith, until 1975, when researcher Thomas Bradford found a marriage license from Billings, Montana, dated 1896. The paper said that Anna Smith, 19, married James Wilson, a rancher. The bride's mother was listed as Ruth Smith, deceased. This can't be confirmed as the same Anna Smith who was born to Ruth Blackwood. But the timing and place match Edwin Marsh's story about seeing women who looked like the Blackwood sisters in Montana around the same time. Bradford tried to find Anna Wilson, who was born Anna Smith, in later records, but all he could find were bits and pieces of information. The 1900 census says that James and Anna Wilson lived on a ranch near Billings with their 2-year-old daughter. The census from 1910 says that James Wilson is a widower. There is no death certificate for Anna Wilson, and there is no record of what happened to her daughter. The idea that there might have been a third generation of Blackwoods who may have been raised with the same warped values as their mother and aunt makes the case even more disturbing. If the pattern of passing things down from mother to daughter continued, the Blackwood sisters' psychological legacy could have lasted well into the 20th century. Douglas County looked over all of its historical records, including those related to the Blackwood case, as part of the celebrations for America's bicentennial in 1976. William Stevens, an archivist, found a deposition from Martha Collins, the Blackwood's closest neighbor, that had been missed. It was dated November 1891. Collins said that before the sister was arrested, she saw Ruth Blackwood doing something strange behind the boarding house. Collins, who had been picking hickory nuts in the woods near the property line, said that Ruth stood over a hole that had just been dug and put what looked like small things inside while saying something in a low voice. Collins looked into what had happened after Ruth left and found human teeth arranged in a pattern, covered with herbs and surrounded by small animal bones. Collins told Sheriff Hargrove about this, but it seems that he didn't take it seriously until after the sister was arrested. Robert Thornton found teeth arranged around a crude altar in a cave miles from the boarding house in 1967, which fits with this story. Both of these things point to a ritual aspect of the sisters' actions that goes beyond just eating other people to stay alive. It's not clear if these behaviors were based on a real belief system or were just a way for them to make sense of what they did. In 1978, it was 100 years since Martha Blackwood died. This was around the time that the Boardinghouse started to operate. Edward Jenkins, a local historian, put together a conference on the Blackwood case. It brought together researchers who had looked into different parts of the story. At this meeting, a number of new ideas came up about what might have caused the sisters' behavior. Jenkins showed that the Blackwood property had been used to grow medicinal herbs since the 1852. Botanists found several plants that grow in the area that, when eaten in certain amounts, could cause changes in mental states or paranoid delusions. This made it possible that the sisters' cannibalistic habits were caused by long-term exposure to psychoactive substances, either by eating them on purpose or coming into contact with them in the environment. Another theory looked at how the Civil War affected communities in the Ozarks. Samuel Blackwood's service in a Confederate unit known for its extreme deprivation, along with the general lawlessness and moral chaos of the post-war period, may have led to a situation where traditional moral lines became less clear. This point of view sees the Blackwood case not as an isolated event, but as a very extreme example of the war's psychological effects. Dr. Helen Richards, a psychologist, came up with one of the most controversial ideas at the conference. She said that the sisters may have started eating each other out of real need during a very cold winter, possibly following their father's example. She said that once this taboo was broken, it was easier to justify continuing the practice, especially if it was framed as a way to survive instead of a moral choice. In the 1980 seconds, forensic science took a new look at the Blackwood case. Researchers looked at the bone fragments found in 1968 again because new methods for studying human remains had been developed. Dr. Thomas Caldwell from the University of Missouri found tiny cut marks that gave clues about how the sister worked. He said, "The accuracy of these cuts shows that the person knew how to butcher and human anatomy. They knew exactly how to prepare a body for maximum use." Caldwell also found signs of cooking methods by looking at bones. He wrote, "The patterns of heat exposure are consistent with slow simmering, not direct fire." This fits with stories of the stew being their favorite way to cook, and it suggests that they had a culinary, not just a practical way of eating. This forensic evidence strengthened the idea that the Blackwood murders were planned and carried out with a purpose, rather than being random or impulsive. It looked like the sisters had come up with certain ways to deal with their victims and had improved these methods over time. This methodical way of doing things helps explain how they could keep doing what they were doing for years without getting caught. In 1984, the Douglas County Historical Society got a leather-bound book as a gift from someone who didn't want to be known. The book looked a lot like the journal that was described in the first investigation. It wasn't possible to be sure of the authenticity, but the handwriting looked like samples of Eliza Blackwood's writing that were kept in county records. The book didn't say anything directly about murder or cannibalism, but it did have strange entries that could be seen as connected to those things. One entry from June 1884 said, "Selection remains the key. Quality varies greatly depending on habits and constitution. Those who labor with their hands provide the most nourishment, while those of sedentary profession often require additional seasoning to mask the lingering bitterness." Another entry from October 1889 said, "Winter's approach brings the usual concerns. Have prepared 12 quarts for storage. Should suffice until spring travelers resume." There were also what looked like recipes in the journal, but the ingredients were often mentioned in a roundabout way. One entry called Autumn Preparation gave directions for making a marinade with certain herbs that, according to plant experts, would make tough meat more tender and cover up any bad tastes. The sisters put a lot of thought and effort into these recipes, which made it seem like they didn't just see cooking as a way to get food, but as a skill they had mastered over time. The tone of the journal was probably the most disturbing thing about it. It was cold, practical, and completely lacking in moral reflection. The author wrote about getting ready to kill and eat people in the same way that someone might write about how to keep vegetables fresh or cure ham. The absence of ethical struggle or justification indicates a total disconnection from conventional morality, a psychological condition that enabled the sisters to perpetrate atrocious acts without evident conflict or remorse. As the 20th century came to an end, criminologists, psychologists, and historians were still very interested in the Blackwood case. The fact that women were involved, that cannibalism was involved, and that the sister was able to keep up the appearance of normalcy in their community made it a one-of-a-kind case in American crime history. But there were still many questions that needed to be answered, especially about what happened to the sister in the end and whether there were any descendants who might have continued their practices. Douglas County held a centennial symposium on the case in 1992, exactly 100 years after the jail fire that supposedly killed Eliza and Ruth Blackwood. Researchers from different fields shared their results and ideas, some of which went against what people had always thought about the sisters and their crimes. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a historian, showed evidence that Sheriff Hargrove may have been more involved in the case than people thought before. Mitchell showed that Hargrove bought land from Samuel Blackwood in 1882, just before the older man's death, by looking at land records and financial transactions. The sheriff's official reports and personal journals had never said anything about this deal. Also, bank records showed that Hargrove's account received regular deposits between 1,885 and 1,891 that couldn't be explained by his official salary. Mitchell didn't go so far as to say that Hargrove was directly involved in the Blackwood crimes, but he did say that Hargrove might have known about them before he said he did and might have made money by ignoring them. The sheriff's journal entries from the years after the sister's disappearance show that he seemed guilty and paranoid. This theory could explain that. The symposium also talked about how the sisters chose their victims. Robert Thompson, a crime analyst, gave a statistical analysis of the known and suspected victims. He found patterns that showed careful targeting instead of random chance. The average victim was a man between the ages of 25 and 45 who was traveling alone and had no ties to the area. Most of them worked in jobs that required physical strength and endurance, like farming, laboring, or trades. Thompson said that the sisters seemed to stay away from victims who would be missed right away or whose disappearance would get a lot of attention. They picked men who were on the fringes of society. He said, people whose absence might not be noticed for weeks or months, if at all. This wasn't just practical, it showed a predatory understanding of social vulnerability.